Okay, the loaf and the laptop. Let's put these two things side by side. On the one side, a loaf of bread. On the other side, a laptop computer. They weigh about the same, and although of rather different shape, one rather lumpy and the other rather flat, they are of roughly similar volume. And both are products of human artifice and draw for their manufacture on a range of materials and techniques. And both, for most of us today, are things that we cannot do without. And yet the loaf of bread has been around for at least 8,000 years, whereas the laptop computer has been with us for only a bit over 40 years. So I want to pose a very simple question. Which of these two things, the loaf and the laptop, will outlast the other? Will times to come bring a world of laptops without loaves, or one of loaves without laptops? Much contemporary talk about the future seems to presume the former, laptops without loaves. I believe this is delusional, and that we might do better to prepare for the latter, a day of loaves without laptops. So let me begin with the loaf, and I want just to share my screen. So we got that. And share. Are you seeing a picture there?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Because for some reason I'm not. I don't know why.
I can see
now I am. So you can see, okay. So there you can see a picture of a loaf of bread, I hope. Yes? Yes. Okay. So let me begin with the loaf. In chronological terms, we have evidence that as long as 14,000 years ago, humans were gathering the seeds of wild grasses, predominantly emmer and einkorn, and grinding them into flour to make bread. But the bread was unleavened. The use of a fermentation agent such as yeast to induce the bread dough to rise or to leaven seems to go back to ancient Sumeria some 8 millennia ago, whence it spread to Egypt. And if you were to compare a loaf from ancient Egypt or Sumeria with the loaf being cut and consumed by the peasants in the depiction here from Peter the Bruegel the Elder, dating from 1565. This is just a detail from the picture. Or with the artisanal loaf you might buy from a craft bakery today, you might notice subtle variations of consistency or flavor, but nothing enough to put them in a different category. A loaf of bread was pretty much the same 8,000 years ago as it was in the 16th century when this painting was made, and as it is today, barring perhaps the modern industrially mass-produced variety, the kinds of loaves you get from the supermarket today. So let me now return to the Netherlands of the 16th century and join here with the peasants in their repast. This is a depiction from Peter the Bruegel, Peter Bruegel the Elder, where you can see a group of peasants seated around an old pear tree, while the work of cutting and shearing a luxuriant crop of wheat carries on around them. This painting, it happens to be my favorite painting, is one of a series that Bruegel produced depicting the months of the year, only a few of which survive today, and this particular painting is for the month of August. And what I love about it is that you can see the whole cycle in the whole picture. You can see the whole cycle starting from growing corn, cutting the crop, binding the cutting into sheaves, like up here, carrying the sheaves down to the hay cart, whence they'll be taken to the village for threshing, milling, and baking, and eventually to become the very bread that you can see the peasants eating. You see, they've got a loaf of bread here, look very much like the one I showed you earlier in the basket, and this guy is just cutting a slice. Others are eating their slices along with some gruel. He's got a slice of bread, she's got a slice of bread. So there's a whole cycle here from growing the crop, harvesting the crop, milling, baking, all the way back to eating it again. And you realize that this bread, right at the center of the picture, is caught up in a much wider field of activities and processes, embracing the entire landscape, its people, and the seasonal cycle of their lives. So let's take the word bread to refer not just to the loaf sitting there in the basket here, but the entire field in which it is situated. The loaf is just a loaf, but what we could call bread includes landscape, people, weather, and time. So what can we say about it? What can we say about bread as distinct from just the loaf taken on its own? Let's go back to it. So there it is. First of all, bread is intensely social. It is community building. There's the little community of people at the foot of the tree there, but also of the community working together in the fields, the community in the distant village, and the harbour town by the sea, with the ships connecting it to a wider world. And of course, here you see the community of commensality, of people actually eating together, sitting on a sheaf of corn from which they've just harvested the corn that will then be next year's bread, and so it carries on. So it's very social. Second, bread is placemaking. It's quite interesting to look at this sleeping figure here, the one, he's fast asleep with his head propped up on a tree. And actually, I've shown you just a detail here, but in the picture, he's right in the middle foreground. So this guy is absolutely at the center of the picture. There he is, lying on the earth with his head against the tree. He could almost be a root of the tree himself. And look at the woman, bent over as she binds the sheaves. Actually, you can't see, she's up here. And the cutters with their scythes bent at the knee. So bread binds people to place and binds people to the land. So bread is social, it is placemaking, but thirdly, bread is temporal. It's bound up with the cycle of the seasons and the vagaries of weather. And this is a time that carries on, that passes, but without in any way advancing. It doesn't progress. As surely as the season of the summer harvest will pass, it will come round again. So this time, it's not exactly cyclical, because nothing ever exactly repeats, but it's not linear either, in the sense of an advance that sees the past trailing behind as the future overtakes. It's a special kind of time, and let's call it bread time. So now let me turn to the other thing. Here we go, the laptop. Now, the first laptop computer, this is my laptop. I pictured it with a picture of the bread on the screen. The first laptop or portable computer came onto the market in 1981, and that's just 44 years ago. And over the 4 subsequent decades, well, they've changed a lot, with huge advances in processing power combined with increased portability. And yet, much of the functionality of the laptop depends upon the fact that it is enmeshed in a huge network, most of which is invisible, which extends over the globe and includes massive energy-guzzling supercomputers an estimated 1 million miles of fiber optic cables, and thousands of communication satellites orbiting the planet. So what can we say about this network? Well, again, three things. First, it is intensely antisocial, isolating every user in a private dialogue with the screen. It cuts them off from immediate sensory face-to-face participation in a shared world, substituting for the community of relations formed through such participation a model of interaction in which words, instead of being embodiments of sentiment, become the liquid currency of an information exchange. Insofar as this could be called social at all, it is an atomized sociality utterly opposed to the kind of commensality epitomized by the sharing of bread that we saw in Bruegel's picture at the foot of the pear tree. Second, it is not place-making, but place-denying, because the whole impetus behind design for portability is that the laptop can be used anywhere, in exchanges in which the precise physical location of individual users is immaterial. It doesn't matter where you are. We're all familiar with this. When we're sending emails to one another all the time, we have no idea what continent even the person we're talking to is, and there's nothing to indicate. They could be anywhere. And then third, the laptop is absolutely tied to measured chronological time. It is this that allows users, randomly distributed over the surface of the globe, to achieve virtual simultaneity. And this time, though it does ultimately, I suppose, have an astronomical basis in the diurnal cycles of the Earth, the rotation and annual cycle of its orbit around the sun, this time is indifferent to weather and the seasons. There's a little thing at the bottom right-hand corner of the laptop, tells you exactly what time it is. And on that, in that chronological sense, a minute, an hour, a day are precisely the same, whatever the season, in fair weather or foul. So you see, both the loaf and the laptop are embedded in much wider fields of relations. But the principles by which these relations are constituted are diametrically opposed to one another. And perhaps, if I could put it that way, the most fundamental contrast of all is between bread time and laptop time. And I want to argue that this opposition has its roots in the ways we think about generations and their passage. We modern people are addicted to the idea of progress. And armed with this idea, we think that each generation is destined to supplant its predecessors, projecting its own superior vision for the future over those that went before. So we tend to see generations as layered. This is just a sketch from a blackboard, but we think of generations as following one another as a series of layers like this. So here is, I just want to get rid of this thing. Here is our generation, or maybe this is the generation after ours. This is our generation. This is the generation before ours, the generation before that, the generation before that. And each generation sort of overwrites the generation before. Each one projects its own projects, its own designs on the future, but then the future comes along and rubs those out and puts a new set of designs over the past one. So with each new layer, preceding ones are reduced to rubble, leaving an accumulating pile of debris in its wake. And that's why in modern societies, the iconic machines are the bulldozer and the crane. The bulldozer clears away the what's left of the previous generation's constructions. The crane lifts the new constructions onto this cleared ground from on top. So we're constantly leveling the constructions of generations past and imposing from on top the constructions of our own generation, very often putting these new constructions on top before the constructions of the previous generation are even finished. I mean, how often have you seen half-completed projects leveled in order to make way for a new set of projects? And the result of all that is that with each new layer reducing preceding ones to rubble, the result is an accumulating pile of debris. So in this view, novelty is the name of the game, because only if the new supplants the old, thrusting it back into the past, never to resurface, can we be confident that progress is being made. So in the discourses of modernity, without innovation, there can be no progress, and without progress, no future. I wanted just to read a bit from a classic from Walter Benjamin. Benjamin was writing he's referring to the angel of history, writing just in the 1940 during the war. This got stuck now. Just a moment. There we go. This is a famous picture by the artist Paul Klee, Angelus Novus, the angel of history. We don't know what Klee actually meant by this painting, but it was acquired by Walter Benjamin, who gave it a particular interpretation, and he had the idea that this angel. I'll just read it. This is how he described the angel of history. This is Walter Benjamin writing in 1940. The painting itself dates from 1920. His face is turned toward the past. Where we perceive a chain of events, he sees one single catastrophe which keeps piling wreckage upon wreckage and hurls it in front of his feet. The angel would like to stay, awaken the dead, and make whole what has been smashed. But a storm is blowing from paradise. It has got caught in his wings with such violence that the angel can no longer close them. The storm irresistibly propels him into the future to which his back is turned, while the pile of debris before him grows skyward. And this storm is what we call progress. So the idea there is that we're all pointing towards what we see as the future, with the great advances of the future. The angel of history has turned its back on all that and is looking towards the ancestors, looking towards the past. He'd like to wake them up. But from his stance, with his back towards the future, what he sees is an enormous pileup of debris as generation after generation overwrites the projects of its forerunners. It's a very striking kind of image. But novelty and innovation is one thing. Renewal is quite another. And I would argue that there is renewal only in following old ways, not turning our backs on previous generations, but in carrying on in their footsteps. And in this view, the ancestors are always before us. They are our future, where we follow on behind. Here's a diagram in which I tried to explain this. It's from a book, I think it's being published in Spanish tomorrow. It's a book in English called The Rise and Fall of Generation Now, where I've tried to explain, partly through this diagram, the difference between past, pre-modern, and often indigenous ways of thinking about past and future, and the way we think about it in post-Enlightenment modernity. For most indigenous people, this indicates a person moving forwards, and the nose indicates this is the nose. So you're looking from the top, and this indicates the direction of travel. So everything's going this way. To think about this, I imagined people lining up in a queue. Suppose right up at the front of the queue, there is an ice cream van, and everybody is queuing up to buy their ice cream. And the people who came before you are closer to the van or just about to get their ice cream. Then there's you, and then there are the people who came after you. They'll get their ice creams after you. And everybody's gradually moving forward in this direction. So you are hoping that in your future, you will be where the people who came before you are now, and the people behind you will, in their future, be where you are now. And so it carries on. So now imagine this queue as generations following one another. Then the people who went before us, the people who are before us, are actually our ancestors. And we are following in their footsteps, and our descendants are following in our footsteps in one continuous progression like this, in which we are actually moving in the direction of what we nowadays would call the past, but it actually holds the promise of the future. But what happened with the onset of modernity, it's as if you're standing in the queue there, looking towards, in the direction of the ice cream van, looking towards the people who came before you, towards your ancestors. Suppose you then turn around. You turn around and you say, I am here. This is my present. This is my time. You then have your back to the people who went before you. They're now past, they're disappearing, they're over, and you are face to face with a future, that is the people coming after you, your descendants, who are coming straight at you and are about to collide. And that is the condition, I think, in which we are faced in modernity, where each generation comes face to face with the generation that it sees will eventually replace it. And progress then is seen as the sequence of these replacements, in which each generation tries to make a better world by comparison to the world of the generations before. But in this original model, where there's no real present, there's just the future's past, in this original model, generations don't so much supplant one another as carry on, twisting around each other, rather like the fibers of a rope. And that's what got me to this picture on the left here. If we imagine every generation not as a layer, but as a fiber, here's one generation giving rise to another, which gives rise to another, which gives rise to another. Instead of a series of layers, we get a kind of braid where generations overlap and twist around one another and create the future together as they go along. And one could imagine that as a kind, not as a series of layers, but as a rope. And because when you twist a rope out of fibers, every fiber is only so long, but by introducing new fibers as fast as old ones give out, the rope can wind on indefinitely. And it's the same, I think, with lives, such as the peasants we saw, oops, it's gone the wrong way, in our picture of the harvesters. Sorry, I meant to go. There we are. Such as with these people here. But this involves a different register of time, a time not of diachronic replacement and succession, but a time of weather and the seasons, of breaking waves and running rivers, a time of the growth and decay of vegetation, and the coming and going of animals, of breaths and heartbeats. And this, I would contend, this is the time of bread. And as we've seen, the history of bread is not a history of progress. Bread baked thousands of years ago is not much different from bread baked 500 years ago, or even today. But the history of bread is a history of life, a life in which each generation, far from turning its back on its predecessors, as we saw in this model here, where each generation, rather than turning its back on its predecessors, follows on in the same ancestral paths, renewing them as it goes. And in this register of time, the actual chronological antiquity of things makes no difference. When renewal comes from following old ways, it actually makes no more sense to inquire into the antiquity of bread than it is to ask how old is a river, or how old the wind, or how old even is a grain of wheat. So what if we were to, once again, foreground the sense of time, that is bread time, associated with the continual renewal of life? What if we thought of generations as wrapping around one another like wheat stalks in a sheaf, rather than supplanting one another in layers? And this means thinking of the future not as a problem to be solved, but as a life to be lived. And I think at this point I'm going to go back to see, and there, if you can see me again, I hope you can, you'll see that I'm sitting in my study, and on the behind me is my favorite picture, the Bruegel picture I was just talking about, which hangs on my wall and reminds me every day of all of this. But what if we thought of generations as wrapping around one another like wheat stalks in a sheaf, rather than supplanting one another in layers? And this means thinking of the future not as a problem to be solved, but as a life to be lived. So let's cast our minds backward to generations to come. You see, I'm casting backward to generations to come, because these generations to come are behind me and I have to look around to see them. So I cast my mind backward to generations to come, the generations behind us, hundreds or even thousands of years from now. What can we say about them? It's striking how much people talk about the future. They're worrying about what it'll be like in 10 years, 15 years, 20 years, maybe the end of this century. But are they thinking about 300 years from now? I mean, we're still living in the shadow of the Enlightenment, which was around 300 years ago, where people came up with a kind of settlement, a kind of idea about what humanity is about and what we're for and what we're trying to do, which has lasted for some 300 years. But we've now reached a crisis point, because we realize that the whole doctrine of progress that the Enlightenment established 300 years ago has come at a cost, or two costs actually. One, a cost of environmental devastation, as we've used the environment as simply as a place to dig up resources to fuel our own progress. And secondly, a cost of mounting social injustice, as we've treated the people, inhabitants of those lands, as less than human. So we've reached a point where we need to find a new settlement. So I imagine that maybe those Enlightenment thinkers 300 years ago, they might have thought to themselves, I wonder what people will be like in 300 years' time. And those people are us. So now we're at this same juncture. We have to find another settlement. And we should be thinking, I wonder what those people will be like 300 years from now. So I've been wondering, not what would people be like in 50 years or by the end of the century, but in 300 years' time, because we have to think in terms of those kinds of timescales. What can we say about them? And of course, it's pretty hard to know what they'll be like or what kinds of lives they may be living. But I think we can be fairly certain of three things. First of all, these people will still need to eat. And for this, they'll have to labor on the earth and under the sky to grow their food, probably under climatic conditions rather different from those that we encounter today. But then again, the climatic conditions we encounter today are very different from ones encountered in Roman times. Think of the Sahara, for example. Now a desert, was back then was fertile countryside. Moreover, as an ever-increasing proportion of the world's human population lives in cities, it's likely that for our descendants, cities will have become centers of food production as well as habitation. Climatic changes and the disuse of fossil fuels will have made it impossible to move supplies across the globe from rural regions of production to urban centers of consumption, and as happens today. So by then, agriculture and urban planning will have merged into a single design discipline tasked with creating environments for life at high densities. And this discipline might actually derive a lot of inspiration from archaeological research on very ancient civilizations, for example, in Southeast Asia and in Mesoamerica, where very dense urban conurbations growing their own food already existed. So there are precedents to draw on if we go far enough back in time for this kind of high density food growing urban settlement, which will probably be the kind of settlement of times to come. That's the first thing. Secondly, these humans will come to be endowed as we are, these humans will still be endowed as we are with organs of sight, hearing, touch, taste, and smell. They'll have mouths, lips, and vocal cords with a full complement of fingers and toes, and with a nervous system which extends throughout the body and possibly beyond. In other words, they'll have bodies pretty much like ours, capable of looking and feeling where they're going and of responding with sensitivity and precision to variations in environmental conditions, capable of working with the hands and walking on 2 feet, capable of communicating by speech and gesture. So they will be social beings just as we are, but also beings whose lives are rooted in the places they collectively inhabit and the lands they know. But third, and this is the crucial thing, the technology that has come to define our present era will have long since imploded, along with all that depends on it: telecommunications, the internet, artificial intelligence, and robotics. Because this technology, in order to function, will have placed demands on the Earth and its inhabitants that turned out to be simply unsustainable. And these included the enslavement of large numbers of people in often appalling conditions, to the extraction of the rare and highly toxic heavy metals required for digital operations, and the expenditure of vast quantities of energy used to fuel the supercomputers and blast into space the thousands of satellites needed to keep the whole system running. So it simply can't survive. And when people are talking about this vast expansion of artificial intelligence, data centers, and the rest of it, we're only being told in brackets, though increasingly loudly now, that actually this will involve, first of all, the extraction on a colossal scale of rare earths, which aren't actually particularly rare, but whose extraction is so difficult that it creates enormous environmental destruction to get at them, and also will involve absolutely eye-watering expenditures of energy and corresponding emissions. We're not being told about that, but it's becoming ever more clear. So this future of a utopian artificial intelligent world is completely actually ludicrous. It's totally unsustainable, at least in my view. So although we can't tell exactly how the digital era will implode, whether gradually or in one catastrophic event, we can be confident that it will do so eventually. It's a bit like saying, I know 100% certain that I'm going to die. I have no idea when, how it's going to happen, but it will. And I think we can be equally 100% certain that we don't know when digital technology will collapse, how it will collapse, but of the fact that it will is an absolute certainty. So when this will happen is anyone's guess. So I'm inclined to apply the 150-year rule. That is, that coal's heyday lasted from the 1810s to the 1960s. The age of oil and gas began in the 1910s and will last until perhaps the 2060s. It's on its way out, thankfully. And on that score, the digital era, which started in the 1980s, has until the 2130s. So that's what I put it. 2130. We can reckon on by 2130, digital, all the digital stuff will have imploded. So centuries on, it's certain that our descendants will find themselves depending on all the bodily senses and skills at their disposal to eke out a livelihood at high concentrations on an earth and under heavens that, thanks to the designs of the present, have become veritable junkyards of defunct devices. And yet, even as we turn our backs on past generations, and even on history itself, when we tell us the story of the Anthropocene, it's as though history itself is over. That was the Holocene. We're in the Anthropocene now. We continue to entertain the vision of a post-historic future that turns this inevitable reality back to front. And in this vision, it is bodily organs of action and perception that are destined for extinction, while digital technology will be miraculously self-sustaining. So instead of a human future that is post-digital, we cling to the idea of a digital future that is post-human. And in this imagined future, so-called smart cities, far from being centers of food production, will have become hubs of creativity whose inhabitants, already offloaded into their devices, will have lost all connection with the earth. They could just as well be floating offshore or on artificial islands in space or even on other planets. I mean, this is what you might call the Musk scenario. It's the one that's being sold to us all the time. So if these citizens still have eyes, ears, and other organs of sense, these will have been reduced to portals, mediating a flow of information that connects them into a vast but entirely disembodied and placeless neural network. And in this fully digitized world, fingers and toes, that is the original digits of the human body, will have become mere appendages, relics of an evolutionary past now irrevocably superseded. And what passes for social life will no longer have anything to do with holding on to one another. It will simply be a function of network connectivity. Now, this vision might seem far-fetched, but it is already impacting on the designs of the present. And for an example, we could turn to writing, to the practices of writing. These practices, interestingly enough, the writing has its origins also about 8,000 years ago in Sumeria. So it actually originates from the same place as bread. Bread and writing emerged together in that same melting pot of Mesopotamia in that millennium. And ever since then, literate people from around the world have picked up lines from the past and carried them on in gestures that have traveled from hand to hand through a process of copying involving both imitation and emulation over countless generations. I always marvel at the fact that when I write by hand, and I love to do so, my lines are continuing the lines of my parents, my grandparents, my great-grandparents, all the way through. It's as though you're simply carrying this line on with these curious twists and turns which actually come out and which we can read as letters. And yet today, as we tap our words in a standardized typeface on digital keyboards while directing our gaze at the screen on which they are projected, writing, in the original sense of inscribing a line in a surface, has become a thing of the past. So many adults today are losing skills of handwriting diligently learned in childhood, while for a new generation raised on keypads, they are already deemed obsolete. I mean, primary schools in many countries, kids are being told, don't bother to learn to write. I mean, that's obsolete now. You just have to learn to be proficient on the keypad, on the keyboard. I think this loss is incalculable. I mean, banishing the expressive force of gesture and trace is equivalent in writing to silencing the expressive power of the voice in speech. A society without handwriting would be like one without song, in which words are but the liquid currency of an information economy. And you wonder, after writing, will speech be the next victim of digitization? Will the affective powers of the voice be expelled from speaking, just as the keypad and the screen have expelled the expressive powers of the hand from writing? And will digital synthesizers be left to assemble messages from standardized speech sounds? I always wonder, any of you who've been through Schiphol Airport, Amsterdam's Schiphol Airport, and heard that sort of, is it a female, sort of quasi-female voice telling you what gate number your flight will be, sounding like the most bored person you could possibly ever encounter. Imagine if all our speech was like that monotonous, completely impersonal, unexpressive patter. So I think speaking and writing are precious gifts, all the more so when digital technology self-destructs, as it inevitably will. And I think the same goes for all those skills of livelihood on which the continued survival of humans to come will ultimately depend. And for precisely that reason, we need to take care of those skills, not to declare them obsolete. Skills that have served us well for thousands of years can be lost within a generation, and once lost, they'd be very difficult ever to recover them again. We have to take care of those skills for the sake of our own descendants. So going back to the loaf and the laptop, which of these two things, the loaf or the laptop, will outlast the other? Well, advocates of digital post-humanism would doubtless put their money on the computer. It's time to turn our back on the loaf, they would say, including the laborious business of preparing the soil, growing and harvesting the crop, milling and baking. Why, the digital post-human may not even need to eat, because surely technology will finally solve the problem of life and death, relieving us from the drudgery of having to inhabit aging and increasingly decrepit human bodies. So there's a movement nowadays of transhumanism that's actually advocating this kind of thing, that will eventually solve death, and therefore we won't have to give birth to any future generations. None of all that. We'll just all live forever in or we won't really be living at all, but we'll be downloaded into our devices, which somehow are self-perpetuating. But post-digital humanism, by contrast, would side with the loaf. It's been with us already for 8 millennia, so there's no reason in principle why it shouldn't endure for another 8. But for reasons I've already outlined, the days of the laptop are numbered, even if the toxic residues from discarded devices might continue to stain the earth for thousands of years. So, just finally, it seems to me clear that the laptop belongs to a history of progress, but the loaf does not. And as we've seen, novelty and innovation are one thing, renewal and rejuvenation quite another. And there is renewal only in following old ways, not in turning our backs on previous generations, but in following in their footsteps. In this view, the ancestors, as I showed, are always before us. They are our future, while we come after. And that's why, in talking about our descendants, I said that we should look back, or we should look 300 years behind us, not 300 years before us. Our ancestors are before, our descendants are behind. So generations don't so much supplant one another as carry on. And go back again to that analogy of the rope. So my plea is for a new humanism. Let's call it a post-digital humanism, which, as in the activities of handwriting and bread making, is dedicated not to the supplanting of generations, but to the renewal of life. We surely owe it to generations that will follow ours to grow the skills of bread making and handwriting and all the other skills that served our ancestors for so long. Because far into the future, people will still need them just as they did in the past. So this is not just a nostalgic yearning for a lost childhood. I think it is an essential investment for humans to come. Thanks a lot.
Okay. Yeah, so sorry, my camera is not working at the moment. I don't know why, but thank you so much, Professor Tim, for your presentation and your work. It's so inspiring. And I was just wondering, and I got curious, the second point that you mentioned is very much linked to the dwelling perspective and your previous work. And then I was just wondering if you would like eventually to provide some more link to your previous work on the dwelling and that yeah, in that line of the second point that you raised.
Yeah. So was I'm trying to think what was the first point, what was the second point, but I can try and sort of link it up because it's very long. It's a long story. I was writing about dwelling in the 1990s, and it's now 2020s, and a lot of water has gone under the bridge. So I concocted this phrase in the 1990s, and it's in this book, The Perception of the Environment, which was published in 2000. I concocted this phrase, the dwelling perspective, and of course the idea of dwelling came from Heidegger, and particularly his essay Building Dwelling Thinking, to refer to a perspective that starts from one's existence as a movement from inside a world that is continually unfolding around you. And I still hold on to that view, but it was unfortunate that the link with Heidegger turned out to be unfortunate. I didn't really want to bring in more associations from Heidegger, but inevitably when people read this phrase, the dwelling perspective, they always thought of Heidegger and then brought in a whole lot of Heideggerisms that I didn't want. And part of that was the sense of a kind of cozy localism that this dwelling carries this image of the peasant farmer sitting by his fireside in his home and his little patch in the clearing surrounded by a forest. And I didn't want that. And so after a while, I decided I'm just not going to use this word dwelling because it just carries all the wrong connotations. I'll simply use a word like inhabit, the perspective of habitation, which is much more neutral. And particularly because I wanted to show that dwelling is not something that happens in one place. It's something that happens along paths, along lines of movement in the world, what I call wayfaring, that our living is wayfaring. It's a matter of finding a way through a world that is continually changing and moving around you. It's not a matter of staying in one place. It's true that in this talk, I did emphasize the place making aspect of bread, because bread is something that's primarily produced by villagers, and villagers do tend to have a sort of focal point around which their life revolves. And one reason why I find that Bruegel picture so powerful is that right in the middle is this pear tree and people sitting around a pear tree, and it really conveys this sense of a rooting in the ground and of life sort of coming out of the ground and going back into it in a cycle. So it's that kind of cyclicity, this idea of the ground as something that is not just a platform on which you move about, but it's actually more like a surface that turns in the passage of time, that I've still been trying to sort of figure out. But I should stop there, otherwise it would become far too long an answer. And I see some other questions, and I'm supposed to. So I think Maya Tampe comes first. Thank you. And you're muted at the moment. or at least I can't hear what you. Now you're muted and now you're unmuted, but I still don't hear.
Changing microphones works now.
Now I hear. Now I hear. Yes.
Okay. It's always sorry. Thank you so much, Tim. Wonderful talk. I have a wondering, and I'm sure you've heard that before, and I'm curious to hear how you respond to it, which is that bread making has become quite industrialized, and very few of us would know how to make bread. In fact, I think pretty much exactly a week ago, I, for the very first time in my life, made bread. and so what would it take to recover the skills and the notions of time that you've so beautifully lined out and described in nowadays world? How could we create the space for bread time? Space and time for bread time, because it seems to be already at risk of getting lost. So what would you say to that?
I don't actually know how we do it. All I can say is that this whole thing, this loaf and laptop thing, was inspired by my marginal involvement a couple of years ago, maybe 3 years ago now, in something called the Madre Project, which was being developed by a group of really talented artists, chefs, and others in Milan. And the project had bought some land on the outskirts of the city, where they had then involved local school children in the whole process of sowing the wheat, harvesting, milling, working with the flour, baking, the rest of it. And they got a lot of prominent Milan chefs and food producers quite invested in this project, and they had purchased a sort of container lorry, which had been fully equipped with a baking oven and all you need to bake bread, and they were going to go basically around the country doing demonstrations. And actually, I think it's sort of grassroots operation. It's not anything enormous, but that seems to me to be the way forward. That is to say that we have to inspire kids to because it's a huge fun. I mean, the kids loved it. They really did. And getting their hands all messy in the dough was just great. And then the feeling that that's actually creating this food that they actually eat was enormously rewarding for them. So what it points to is a different way of doing education, in which relations to the earth, food growing, planting will be central. And talk to teachers, they're all dying for this kind of thing, and many of them are practicing it as far as they can, but they're very great bureaucratic and time restrictions on what can be done. I also remember a speech by I think Carlos Petrini, the founder of the slow food movement, he gave a talk once and told that he was once in front of a huge audience of young people, and he'd a couple of thousand or something, and he'd asked them how many among you are planning to be farmers when you grow up, and about 2 people have put their hands up, and it just shows them how on earth do we think we can have any kind of food security for the future if nobody actually is interested in working on a farm or equivalent. So there's a really important educational job to be done, and I think the first step is to show that this is not simply a technological problem, that we can't somehow produce newfangled techniques that will somehow solve the world's food production. We need to get people on the land and really feel that. And it sometimes looks like I feel the task is absolutely essential, but it looks it's like a Herculean task. I don't know how we even really get up to the scale that would be necessary. Is to me, I don't know, but I think that's what we need to do. Yes,
Thank you so much.
then Stein.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much, Professor Ingold, for this truly inspiring talk and really refreshing to also hear in the ongoing debates on digital developments. I'm a PhD student, so I've been making my way through your books and your works, and they're truly inspiring. And there's a question that keeps on lingering in my mind also after this talk, and maybe I'm playing a bit of the devil's advocate here, but I was thinking, if we go way back and think about ourselves as the hunters and gatherers who were there when the bread was invented or found, or how you would say it, and the writing was uh, developed, would they not be a little bit the same as we are now then with these digital technologies? Would they be like, this is never going to last. Hunting and gathering is the way to go. This bread phase, it's just a phase. It will go away. These villages that are being created, who wants to live there? We want to be out in the environment. Come on. Well, how ridiculous. And it's kind of the question that lingers, and also in the reading of your work, it shows the evolution of generation on generation, but it's very hard to, without the benefit of hindsight, pinpoint when were there radical moments that stayed, that lingered, that remained, and how do you in your thinking deal with kind of radical revolutionary moments that don't always seem to necessarily fit very nicely, but that's my limited understanding, so that's why I'm very happy that I have the chance to ask you in person. In your writing on these fibers that keep on connecting. So yeah, maybe a connection with our hunters and gatherers that probably had the same question 8,000 years ago with me right now. So yeah, looking forward to your response.
There are two kinds of answers. One is that there is an argument is often made that, of course, there have been so-called revolutions of a quasi-technological kind in human history, which could be compared to the digital revolution of today, such as the birth of printing with Gutenberg and so on, which completely changed the distribution of the written word, and then various kinds of milestones in science and mathematics, sort of the Copernican revolution, I think, sort of completely changed our view of the world, and this is true. However, most of these things have only been seen as revolutionary in hindsight. So for example, with writing, we know, because it's been quite well studied by scholars, that you could write a sort of great history about how writing was in this great invention, a new technology of the word that then completely transformed the lives of all literate people for thousands of years after that. But at the time, people were finding an expedient solution of how to get down temple records of how much they bought and sold and this kind of thing, and it was just what you might call an expedient, a temporary fix to deal with a local problem. And most things that we judge in hindsight to have been revolutionary were at the time never understood as such. They might have been thought, this is very clever. This will solve we've got a little problem now. We'll fix it this way, and without those people having any idea about what the future of it would be. It's really, I think, only since this really the Enlightenment philosophy really started this whole thing about progress, that we have instilled into our minds the idea that that every creative intervention is something that radically reshapes the whole landscape. We have, for example, in the history of music, we're now taught to think that imagine when people first heard this Beethoven, just imagine what it sounded like, and as though this was a new revolution in music, and then we get to the point where this is what you're supposed to do. So everybody is trying their best to be radical and paradigm busting, and so now, unless you in the humanities, unless you can author a turn, you're nobody. So everybody is trying to be. Everybody wants to be at the cusp of the birth of a new era, because then they'll be famous. But that's in terms of a particular doctrine that we have, of competition and superiority, which in the long term has not, I think, done us very much good. So I think the thing to do is, by all means, let's be inventive. Let's work out solutions to local problems and so on. But let's think of this as an ongoing improvisation, not as a grand narrative of progressive advance.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
So, Elina.
Thank you, Professor Ingold, and for your work and for this inspiring and also thought-provoking talk. And I'll try to articulate my my question, but I was curious what do you think about the evolution of relating, and so how we relate to each other. So you spoke about the loaf of bread, and perhaps I see it as a ways of how we related to each other through the bread, and now how we currently connect and relate to each other through these digital technologies, and what is at the core, I guess, of relating, right? Maybe the bread and the computer is a tool or kind of something that brings us together as we relate. But I wonder, as you mentioned, this post-digital humanism and this kind of human capacities that are essential and the kind of at the core that we need to come back to. What is at the core of us relating to each other? And does it perhaps in a way shape or turns our eyes to ourselves in the way how we relate to ourselves? So I'm curious about this idea of relating and how it evolves, or what's kind of at the core of it.
Thanks for that. I think it's all to do with the difference between the face and the screen, and so let me just put on one side for a moment the question of people who are visually impaired, because there's an issue. But otherwise, when we relate to one another face to face, we see the other's face, and above all, we see their eyes. And we see their eyes as eyes that are looking at us. And we can't see our own face. I can't see my own face. I can't see my own eyes. I can see the eyes of the other who's looking at me. And seeing the other looking at me confirms for me that I exist as a person looking at them. It's what's sometimes been called the reciprocity of vision. And it's absolutely fundamental to the way in which at least sighted humans relate to one another. Peter Sloterdijk has written about, the German philosopher, about this. He imagines two people. He imagines them like a kind of ellipse with two poles. So there's one pole of the ellipse and the other pole. That's you and me, but we're inside this bubble, and it needs both of us to complete the dyad. We couldn't exist without the other, who completes ourselves. For people who are visually impaired, it's a little different, and in fact, there's writing about the problems sometimes you have if you're visually impaired interacting with a person who's sighted, about how you begin sometimes to doubt your own existence because you can't see that confirmation. But then there are other ways of making up for it through hearing. So there are other sensory modalities. But that's the basic idea, that we exist because that existence is seen is looped through the existence of the other to whom we relate. And I mean, the first cut in that comes with the ubiquity of mirrors. And when we see ourselves in the mirror, well, the other, the reflection in the mirror sort of substitutes for the other. My own reflection becomes a substitute for the other who I'd otherwise be looking, whose face I would otherwise be looking into. And then it's a short distance from the mirror. I mean, once we have a society that's used to mirrors, it's quite easy to transition to a society that's used to the screen in the specific sense of the computer screen, or perhaps the cinema screen, where the what's on the other side is not another person looking at you. It might be a text, it might be an image, it might be your own reflection. But then, if you then imagine two people having a conversation by mobile phone, for example. They're both looking at their screens all the time, and it's virtually a conversation between these two screens, and neither can see the other. I think you might argue that that's what happens on an ordinary telephone call. You're phoning on telephoning somebody else in an old-fashioned telephone, and you can't see the other person. But there you have got the inflections of the voice that carry a lot of that information that otherwise you'd see in the person's face. So that I think is really where the difference comes. It's a fundamental distinction in the meaning of interfaciality. And a computer interface is not the same thing as face-to-face, where one living face with eyes is talking to another face with eyes. I think that's where it comes. Yeah. No. Is it an Elena that I can't see?
Hi, Professor Ingold. I'm so sorry. My camera is also problematic, but maybe actually this might add to the substance of what you were just saying about being able to see the eyes between the face. And in this case, you can. But maybe that is what makes my question hopefully a bit more fundamental. I did try to articulate it in the comments, both to help capture what I was trying to invite you to help us understand better through your eyes.
I'm just reading your comment. Sorry, I didn't have the comments on, so I now
That's okay.
Reading that. I'm doing cases management says what it means to be human. That means because I frame management as management, hence about your position, what it means to be human now. Is this an issue about? Is the question really about gender here? Is that you're asking?
No, not at all. I think for me, man is human.
Okay, well, that's all right. So, but the question is,
what does it mean to be human?
Okay.
Yes,
Just a little question.
Yeah.
Just a little question about what it means to be human. I do have an answer, and that is that I think we should turn the word human into a verb, to human. And the inspiration for that actually comes from an amazing, I think this is the right moment to raise it, Ramon Llull, who you have somehow embody in your institution. Ramon Llull was this great mystic philosopher of the 13th century, very prolific, very ecumenical. And at the end of the 1300s, he wrote a book called Nova Logica, the New Logic, in which he tried to define what he meant by the human. And one of the things about Llull was that he had, because of events in his life, he was a Catalan speaker and a Latin speaker, but he also had learned Arabic. And somewhat influenced by his familiarity with Arabic idioms and grammar, he said that homo est animal homificans, this is curious writing, which meant that the human is a humanifying animal. Not a humanizing animal, but a humanifying animal, meaning by that it's an animal that, for Llull, what everything is what they do. So humans are what they do, and therefore humans are continually creating themselves and one another in the crucible of their common life. It's not like saying this is human nature, human is like this or human is like that. It's not like arguing for or against some kind of fixed human essence. It's saying that just being human is a question of continually working at it. So I'm very taken by this idea that to be human is a task. It's a task we have to do, but that still leaves the question, well, what is the difference between humaning and elephanting or anting, or if every creature is doing its thing, then what is particular about humaning as an activity. And at the moment, I'm still wrestling with this question, as is everybody else, but I think it does have something to do with language. But I think that we should start thinking about language not as the executive instrument of rational thought, but as a way of listening. Above all, it's a way of listening, and through listening, we give a voice to things they would not otherwise have. Things that don't necessarily have ears, that can't necessarily hear themselves. By listening to things, we allow other things to have a voice, and we can hear the way in which those voices relate to one another in the kind of chorus. We can hear the chorus of the world in a way that the wind and the waterfall and the glacier and the trees cannot. And because of that, we can weave them together to tell a story not just of our own lives, but a story for the world. What we call it myth. And that, I think, gives us a special kind of responsibility for looking after the life that is around us. So I do actually believe that humans are exceptional in that regard. The exceptionality doesn't place us above the world, it places us at the heart of it and gives us some particular responsibilities upon which we have largely reneged in modern times. We have to find those responsibilities again, and I think that means becoming human again, as we've lost much of our humanity in abrogating the kinds of responsibilities that used to be recognized by most indigenous people of the world. So that's the best.
A wonderful response. That's a wonderful response. You opened so many more questions. Thank you so very, very much. Thank you.
Emmanuelle is raising her hand, so.
Thank you so much. I couldn't raise my hand digitally for some reason. Thank you so much for this thought-provoking talk. It's really raises a lot of questions, is inspiring. And as Maha mentioned at the beginning of the presentation today, you have been an inspiration for many scholars in management, in information systems. And what I was really struck by today was your insistence on post-digitization, this idea of digitalization as being a moment in time that is we need to look backwards on already. And this is fairly distinct from what most researchers I know, including myself, do, which we're really studying the digitization. And I wanted to get your perspective on humaning in the digitization era, and in particular on agency. How would you think about or rethink agency in this era that may or may not be transformed in the future?
Gosh, I mean, I wouldn't dismiss the kind of work that you and your colleagues are doing, in the sense that I think that we have to, I mean, it's imperative that we understand what the digital world is doing and what it's doing to us, because only then can we begin to understand how we can move beyond it. We can't simply turn our backs on it because it's all around. We have to deal with it somehow, and I am simply saying that we have to deal with it on the understanding that it's a phenomenon that will not last forever, rather than on the understanding that it's the future for everything for all time. But the question was more. Sorry, I've suddenly lost the question. The question was, how should we say it again? Sorry,
So, well, the counter side to this question is there something special about agency that we need to rethink?
That was maybe. It, yeah. I knew the word suddenly in my panic, I lost it. I actually don't like the word agency very much, and I have no problem with act or acting. I have a problem with agency because it makes it look as though the action, what happens, the movement, is an effect of a cause. So this agency was the cause that produced such and such an effect. And I think my own sort of starting point is very processual. I would say that with Whitehead and Bergson, I'm a fan of a processual ontology in which everything is in effect the cause and effect of itself, and because you're talking about a process that is going on, and as soon as we talk about agency, one abstracts somehow, takes things out from the process. So, and I think that overemphasis on agency can be harmful in that it we because we're speakers of European languages, or not all of us, but many of us, we tend to work with the subject verb object structure. So there's the agent, the subject, there's the object, whatever the subject causes, and there's the verb in between, subject, and it's just, so the verb, what actually happens is they're in between the agent and the effect. I think the way forward is to expand the verb so that both the agent and the effect are incorporated inside it. I found much inspiration in the idea of the middle voice of the verb, which is apparently a voice, even ancient Greek had it, and some other Indo-European languages. It's very common in non-Indo-European languages. It's not active, it's not passive. It's not like I'm the agent, I did this, or it's not like I'm the patient, this was done to me. I'm actually inside the action itself. What I do does something in me, and this is the middle voice, and I find this somehow it immediately solved a whole lot of problems for me in dealing with this issue of agency. It means that instead of saying I did that, things happen and you say, oh, was that me? So agency becomes a question rather than an assertive. It's not an assertion, it's more like a query. So that's the direction I'd like to go in. I thought of it in terms of the example of walking. I mean, I might decide that I want to go for a walk. I'm an agent. I'm going to go for a walk today. Okay, my agency. I go for the walk, but once I'm out walking and my body is striding along, not unconsciously, then not only do I feel I walk, but somehow my walking walks me. That I'm inside the process itself, and it's not that my body is what my body is doing is an effect of my agency. Could just as well say the other way around, and the agency is an effect of what my body is doing. But I'm just simply inside the process of my going along in the world. So that's what I think we need to do.
Can I ask a follow-up question on that? I mean, I know I'm sort of pushing. Maybe if anybody else doesn't have a question, I mean, if they do, I'm happy to hold off and wait. But I'm also conscious of time, and we only have a few more minutes. And I know you probably have to get back to work, Professor. So if I could just follow up on what the question Emma asked, and just to push you just a little bit more, because even though I love what you just said, and it's so wonderfully thought-provoking, if I think about trying to use those ideas, let's say in my world of software development, for instance, and developers and algorithms all working together. I mean, the only way I've sort of up to this point, sorry, I've got a sore throat. The only way I've tried to make sense of this to this point is to think of it more as some sort of collective agency. So I'm not sure I could talk about the self-reflection if it were to be an algorithm, for instance, and maybe and I'm happy to hear your thoughts on this, what you would think if I said something like algorithms they do act, using your terminology, and because that, in that process it wouldn't work. So yes, sorry, just to continue that.
Well, this whole thing about algorithms is a bit terrifying, and it's true that we worry, that well, as many people would say, many of us are losing our agency to an algorithm that is deciding all sorts of things for us without our even knowing. And this is that's the way it would often be phrased, and that it's a rather worrying prospect, and clearly that's the case. And part of the problem, I think, is that the people who are engineering this kind of thing, that is the ones who are designing the software systems, using the algorithms, all of this, which is far beyond my comprehension. The people who are talking up artificial intelligence are adopting a model of agency and of intelligence and of cognition, which comes straight out of cognitive science and cognitive neuroscience, which has a whole lot of assumptions built into it. And it's not surprising that then if you embody those assumptions into your technology, then that's the way it's going to work. And we then find ourselves, to some extent, imprisoned within them. I mean, it's a bit like economists. Economists have all kinds of assumptions. They then try to manage the economy according to those assumptions, and we find ourselves, having to cope with the outcomes, which are often bizarre and not what we expect, and beyond our control. And I think it's rather similar here. We most of us don't understand how this thing works. We have no understanding of certainly of the kind of ontological premises of software design or anything of this kind. So we sometimes experience it as a kind of assault on our own senses and our own decision-making capacity. And I don't know the way out of it, except that somebody was pointing out that, for example, with artificial intelligence, that it's absolutely the wrong thing to call this. Both artificial and intelligence were completely the wrong words. And this person I was talking to had an alternative. Now I've forgotten what it was, but two completely different words. That both words are extraordinarily misleading, or impose an idea of what intelligence is and what artificiality is, which really impoverish both. And my worry is that, particularly the people are always going on about what artificial intelligence can do and what it can't do, but it cannot, so far as I understand, hear that chorus of voices in the world. It can't. And the fact that we think that the algorithms can somehow substitute for a lot of things of what we're doing shows just how impoverished our own understanding of language and of sensory perception is. So we need to stand up, I think, and make our voices heard about this.
Thank you for that. That was very helpful. There might be a moment or so for any last question, and then we will have to end it. So anyone still got a burning question they've been too shy to ask?
I can make just one concluding comment, which is this is so interesting. Oh, there is one question here. Sorry, Yang Ting.
Yes. Hi, Professor Ingold. Thank you so much for the great talk and of course your work. And I actually have a follow-up question on your response to Emma's earlier question. I remember you talked about that deciding to go walking was not an unconscious action, but in your work, I remembered that you also talked about you also had some discussion saying, well, we actually move without intention. So I was thinking, well, how any perspectives on, I don't know how to phrase this, a balance or, yeah.
I said without intention, but with attention, and that's the key thing.
Yeah.
So saying we're not moving, if I'm walking, I'm saying I'm not walking intentionally, is not to say that I'm just kind of an automaton and I just left it to my body to do it, but that I'm walking attentively, and I want to make that very clear distinction that the way we walk, the way we move, is always responsive to an ongoing perception of the task as it's unfolding, and that's the key thing. So instead of seeing attention as simply an aspect of how intention works, I want to put it the other way around and say that, well, there is intention, but it's an aspect of the way attention works, and we have to start with that focus on attentionality, which also links to the idea of habit, not in the sense of just an automated action like changing gear on the car or brushing your teeth, but habit in the sense of a way of inhabiting the world attentively, of being at home in it. I find it a very useful word. I hope
True, true. Sorry, just very quickly follow up if I may. So what about the decision itself? So the decision of go for a walk, would that be from your
the way it is. I mean, if you were telling the story to somebody else afterwards, you say, yeah, I did, you're talking to your friend, and you say, it was a lovely day, I decided to go for a walk. Well, you did. And so you, in reconstructing the whole thing, you would say, I was, the weather was nice, I made this decision, I had some time, and off I went. And it all sounds very clear cut. It's not so clear in the middle of it all, when you're kind of thinking, do I go for a walk or not? And and we often say colloquially, well, the idea kind of grew on me. Because it was a fine day and somehow my limbs felt restless and I wanted some fresh air. And so the thing kind of develops. It's very difficult to find a moment in which you can really place yourself outside the whole thing, as if you made this decision and then implement it. Decisions are usually, the word decision, the cis part of it implies a cut. But I said that the cut of decision making is along the grain of the action, not across it. So it's like splitting it along, and you decide you're going to go this way. When people talk about path dependency, that's what they mean, that you're going that way and rather than the end going that way. Does that make sense?
Yes, yes.
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you so much. That's a great response. Thank you.
My closing comment was only just to say that it's so interesting that from outside management studies, we often have a rather dismal view of management, and then we find that you talk to management scholars and they're all actually far ahead of the game, already thinking about post management, if you like, or whatever the thing is. I remember years ago, when I was still based at the University of Manchester, and our Department of Anthropology was in a 5-story building, and on the 4th story was a Department of Accounting and Business Finance. And we got on with them tremendously well, because if you want to make any money, you don't go into a university Department of Accounting and Business Finance. So the people who were in the department were all Marxists and revolutionaries and wanted to break down the whole system. So anarchists. So we had a great time. So I have a feeling that probably people in management studies are a bit, perhaps you're all anarchists too. So there's great hope in what you're doing.